The grave was still fresh when the first cold wind of October came across the Kansas flats and found Edith Harwell standing beside it with her hands at her sides and her dog pressed against her leg, and nothing else in the world that belonged to her except the dirt beneath her boots and the sky above her head. She had dug the grave herself 8 months before in February, when the ground was frozen and the shovel rang against it like iron striking iron. She had dug it in the dark because Walter had died at sunset, and she could not bear to leave him inside the cabin through the night, not with his eyes still open, not with his hands still warm. She had wrapped him in the quilt her mother had sewn for their wedding, and she had carried him out to the spot beneath the cottonwood where he had liked to sit on summer evenings. And she had dug until the blisters on her palms broke, and bled and froze, and broke again. And when the hole was deep enough, she had lowered him in and covered him, and stood there until the stars came out, and the coyotes began to call from the far ridge, and the world went on without him, the way the world always goes on. Walter Harwell had been a carpenter, a quiet man with steady hands and a way of looking at wood, the way some men look at women with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. He had come west from Indiana in 1869 with $80 in a set of chisels wrapped in oilcloth, and he had found this valley, this long flat stretch of grass and sky between the creeks, and he had said to Edith on their second night, camped under the cottonwood, "This is the place, Edie. I can feel it in the ground." He had built their cabin with his own hands. Cottonwood logs hauled from the creek bottom, notched and fitted so tight you could not slide a knife blade between them. A plank floor sanded smooth. A stone chimney he had laid himself, each stone chosen for its shape and color, because Walter believed that even a chimney deserved to be built with care. It was not a large cabin, it was not a fine cabin, but it was solid and it was warm and it was theirs, and for 5 years they had lived in it together, and Edith had loved every board and beam and pane of glass in it because Walter's hands had touched them all. The typhoid had come in January of 1874. It came the way typhoid always comes on the frontier, quietly through bad water or spoiled food, or the invisible cruelty of a world that does not care how much a man is loved. Walter had been strong for the first 3 days. He had sat up in bed and eaten broth and told Edith not to worry, told her it was just a chill, told her he would be back on his feet by Friday. But by Thursday his fever was 104, and his eyes had gone glassy, and his hands, those steady carpenter's hands, shook so badly he could not hold a cup. She had ridden 11 miles to town for the doctor. The doctor had come back with her, looked at Walter, shaken his head slowly, and left a bottle of laudanum on the table. He did not charge her for it. That was how she knew. Walter died on a Sunday evening in February with his hand in hers and his eyes on her face, and his last words so quiet she had to lean close to hear them. He said, "I am sorry, Edie. I am sorry I have to leave you here." She had not cried then. She had not cried at the funeral, which was attended by Reverend Phineas Alcott and two neighbor women and the dog. She had not cried in the weeks and months that followed, because crying was a thing you did when you had someone to cry to, and Edith Harwell had no one. She had Boone. Boone was a German shepherd, 4 years old, 70 pounds of muscle and loyalty, and an intelligence that sometimes made Edith uneasy because she was not entirely certain the dog did not understand English. Walter had gotten him as a pup from a German immigrant family passing through the valley, and he had named him after Daniel Boone because the pup had a habit of disappearing into the tall grasses and coming back hours later with something in his mouth, a rabbit, a prairie hen. Once, an entire rattlesnake, dead and neatly bitten in half behind the head. Boone had not left Edith's side since Walter died. Not once. He slept at the foot of her bed. He walked beside her when she went to the well. He sat at the edge of the garden and watched her work with his ears up and his eyes moving, scanning the horizon the way a sentry scans a tree line. And if anything came within 100 yards of the cabin that did not belong there, Boone knew about it before Edith did. She talked to him. She knew that was something people in town would laugh about if they heard a widow talking to her dog, but she did not care. She talked to him because the silence was too large and too heavy, and if she did not fill it with something, it would swallow her whole. "We are going to be all right, boy," she would say in the mornings, pouring water into the tin pan for him while the coffee heated on the stove. "We are going to figure this out." Boone would thump his tail against the floor and look at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she would believe it at least until sundown, when the shadows came back and the cabin felt too empty, and the wind outside sounded like something calling a name she did not want to hear. By October of 1874, she had been alone for 8 months. She had kept the garden going. She had chopped her own wood. She had patched the roof twice once in a rainstorm that nearly took her off the ladder. She had shot a coyote that came too close to the chicken coop and skinned it and stretched the hide on a frame the way Walter had taught her. She had survived. But surviving and living are not the same thing, and Edith Harwell knew the difference, and she knew that the winter coming toward her across the Kansas plains was not a winter she could survive the way she had survived the spring and the summer. Spring and summer were forgiving. Winter was not. It was on the third day of October that the buggy came up the road. She saw it from the garden where she was pulling the last of the turnips, a black two-horse buggy with brass fittings and a leather canopy, the kind of buggy that cost more than most homesteads in Flint Creek were worth. Boone saw it too. He stood up from where he had been lying in the shade of the cottonwood, and he stared at it, and a low sound came from his chest that was not quite a growl, but was not far from one. "Easy, boy," Edith said. She set down the turnips. She wiped her hands on her apron. She waited. The buggy pulled up at the edge of her yard. Two men stepped down. The first was a large man in a black coat and a tall hat, with a face like a slab of granite that had been weathered by 62 years of sun and wind, and the particular kind of self-regard that comes from having more money than everyone around you for a very long time. His name was Judge Cornelius Slade. The second man was younger, maybe 40, lean and sharp-faced, with the restless eyes of a man who was always calculating something. His name was Orville Pratt. He managed Judge Slade's properties, collected Judge Slade's rents, and performed whatever other services the judge required, not all of which were recorded in any ledger. Slade did not come into the yard. He stood at the gate, one hand on the fence post, and he looked at Edith the way a man looks at a piece of land he is thinking of buying. "Mrs. Harwell," he said. "Judge Slade, I trust you are well." She did not answer that. She was not well, and they both knew it, and the pretense was an insult. "I have come on a matter of business," Slade said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out toward her. Pratt stepped forward and carried it across the yard and placed it in her hand without meeting her eyes. She unfolded it. She read it. She read it again. The words did not change. It was a promissory note, dated March the 14th, 1874, 1 month after Walter's death. It bore Walter's signature at the bottom, and Edith recognized the handwriting, the careful slant of it, the way the W leaned slightly to the right. It was Walter's hand. There was no question. The note said that Walter Harwell had borrowed $200 from Judge Cornelius Slade, secured against the homestead and the 40 acres of deeded land attached to it. $200 for seed and medicine, due upon demand or within 12 months of the date of signing, whichever came first. Edith looked up from the paper. Her face did not change. Her hands did not shake. But something inside her chest shifted the way the ground shifts before a sinkhole opens a slow, deep, irreversible movement. "He never told me," she said. Slade adjusted his hat. "That is not my concern, Mrs. Harwell. What is my concern is the $200, which is now 9 months overdue, and the collateral, which is the ground you are standing on. I do not have $200. I am aware of that." "Then what do you want, Judge?" Slade looked at her for a long time. He was a man who had learned over 62 years how to use silence the way other men used hammers. He let the silence do its work. Then he spoke. "I will give you until the 1st of March, he said, 5 months. If on that date you have not repaid the debt in full, you will sign a transfer of deed and you will vacate this property within 30 days. That is generous, Mrs. Harwell. Most men in my position would not wait 5 months. Edith stood very still. The turnips were in the dirt at her feet. The wind was picking up from the west. Boone was pressed against her leg, his body tense, his eyes on Slade. "And if I refuse," she said. "You will not refuse," Slade said, "because the note is valid. The signature is your husband's. And the law in Kansas Territory is quite clear on the matter of secured debts." He tipped his hat. He turned. He walked back to the buggy. Pratt followed. They climbed in. The driver turned the horses and the buggy rolled back down the road toward town, and Edith stood in the garden with the paper in her hand and watched it go, and she did not move for a very long time. She went inside. She sat at the table. She spread the note flat, and she looked at Walter's signature, and she pressed her fingers against the ink as if she could feel his hand through the paper. "You fool," she whispered. "You beautiful fool." Because she understood now. She understood why. Walter had borrowed the money in March. He'd been sick since January. He had known by March that he was dying, and he had gone to the one man in the valley with money to lend the one man Walter had never trusted, the one man Walter had told Edith to stay away from, and he had signed his name and taken $200 because he needed seed for the spring planting and medicine for the fever that was killing him. And he had done it because he loved her, because he wanted her to have a crop and a chance after he was gone, and he had not told her because he did not want her to carry that weight while he was dying. He had carried it alone, and now it had been passed to her. She folded the note. She put it in the tin box on the shelf where she kept the marriage certificate and the deed, and the one photograph of Walter she owned, a tintype taken in a studio in Topeka the year they were married. She closed the box. She went outside. She stood in the yard and looked at the sky. Then she looked at the cabin. The roof was bad. She had known it was bad since August. The ridgepole was cracked, probably from the weight of last winter's snow, and two of the rafters had shifted, and there was a gap on the north side where the wind came through at night and made the candle flame bend sideways. She had been meaning to fix it. She had not fixed it. She had not fixed it because fixing a roof requires lumber, and lumber costs money, and Edith Harwell did not have money. She had $17 in a coffee tin behind the stove. That was everything. She looked at the cabin, and she looked at the sky, and she looked at the long, flat stretch of grass that ran from her yard to the horizon in every direction. Grass as tall as her waist, thick and brown and endless. And the wind moved through it in slow waves, and somewhere in her mind, a door opened. Not a thought, not yet. A feeling, a recognition. The way you recognize a face in a crowd before you can put a name to it. She walked out into the grass. She walked maybe 50 yards from the cabin to a spot where the sod was thick and old, and the roots had been growing and tangling for 100 years. She knelt down. She pressed her hand flat against the earth. It was dense, solid, woven together by a million tiny roots into a mat so tight that water could not pass through it and wine could not tear it apart. She had seen a prairie dog town once on the south side of the creek, a whole city of tunnels and chambers dug into the sod, and she had noticed the way she noticed things, that the prairie dogs were warm in winter and cool in summer, and that their tunnels did not collapse even when cattle walked over them because the sod above them was as strong as any roof a man could build. She stayed kneeling in the grass for a long time. Boone came out and sat beside her. He put his nose against her hand. "I have an idea, boy," she said. She stood up. She walked back to the cabin. She went inside and found the charcoal stub that Walter had kept in the drawer beside his chisels, and she found a piece of brown paper, and she sat at the table and she began to draw. She drew a cabin, not a log cabin, not a frame cabin, a cabin made of sod, made of the earth itself cut into bricks and stacked the way a mason stacks stone, sealed with mud, roofed with poles and more sod, insulated by the very grass that grew on the prairie in every direction for as far as the eye could see. She drew for 2 hours. She was not an artist, the lines were rough and the proportions were not always right. But she knew what she was drawing, and she knew it would work because she had seen it work in the ground beneath her feet for every day of the 5 years she had lived on this land. The grass was free, the dirt was free, the labor was hers, and the walls of a sod cabin, she calculated, pressing the charcoal hard against the paper, would be 2 feet thick, 2 feet of packed earth and woven roots between her family and the wind, 2 feet between her and the cold, 2 feet between her and Judge Cornelius Slade and everything he represented. She pinned the drawing to the wall above the table. She stepped back and looked at it. "All right, Walter," she said. "You built me a cabin out of wood. I am going to build one out of dirt." The next morning, she began. There was a boy who came by the cabin every few days. His name was Cormac Hollis. He was 14 years old, thin as a fence rail, with a mop of dark hair that fell across his forehead and a pair of brown eyes that were too old for his face. He was an orphan. His parents had died of cholera on the wagon trail from Missouri when he was 9, and he had been passed from family to family in the valley like a piece of furniture nobody quite wanted until Judge Slade had taken him on as a yard hand at his ranch, which meant that Cormac Hollis slept in the barn and worked 12 hours a day and was fed whatever the cook did not want and was beaten when Orville Pratt was in a bad temper, which was often. Cormac had started coming by the Harwell place in the spring, not long after Walter died. He would appear at the edge of the yard in the late afternoon quiet as a cat with a small cloth bundle in his hand. The bundle usually contained a biscuit or a piece of dried meat or a handful of dried apples, whatever he had been able to pocket from the Slade kitchen without being noticed. He would leave the bundle on the fence post and start to walk away, and Edith would call out to him and make him sit on the porch and drink water and eat half of whatever he had brought because the boy was thinner than he should have been, and his wrists were bruised in places that wrists should not be bruised. Boone loved the boy. That was the thing that had decided Edith. Boone did not love easily. He tolerated most people. He endured a few. But he loved Cormac Hollis. The first time the boy had come into the yard, Boone had walked up to him and put his head against the boy's leg and stayed there. And Cormac had knelt down and put his arms around the dog's neck and closed his eyes, and Edith had watched from the kitchen window. And she had seen on that boy's face the look of a person who has not been touched with kindness in a very long time. On the morning Edith began cutting sod, Cormac appeared at the edge of the yard. He watched her for 20 minutes without speaking. She was using a spade Walter had left in the shed, a heavy iron spade with a hickory handle, and she was cutting squares of sod about 2 feet long and 1 foot wide and 4 inches thick. The work was harder than she had expected. The roots were dense and the spade had to be driven deep, and each brick weighed close to 30 pounds. And by the time she had cut 10 of them, her arms were shaking and her back was on fire. "What are you doing, Mrs. Harwell?" Cormac said at last. She looked up. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat. Her hair had come loose from its braid and hung in damp strands across her forehead. "I am cutting bricks," she said, "out of grass, out of sea, grass and dirt and roots. It is stronger than you think." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are they for?" "I am building a cabin." He looked at the spade. He looked at the piles of sod bricks. He looked at her. "Can I help?" he said. She studied him. She saw the bruises on his wrists. She saw the thinness of his coat. She saw the way he stood slightly hunched, the posture of a boy who has learned to make himself small. "Does Judge Slade know you are here?" "No, ma'am. Will there be trouble if he finds out?" "There is always trouble," Cormac said. And the way he said it, flat and matter-of-fact, without self-pity, without complaint, told Edith everything she needed to know about the life this boy was living. "Come in," she said. "Have some water. Then we will cut bricks." They worked together that day, and the next day, and the day after that. Cormac came every afternoon after his chores at the Slade Ranch, and he stayed until dark, and he cut sod and hauled bricks and mixed mud and did not complain. Not once, not even when his hands blistered and bled, because Cormac Hollis had learned a long time ago that work was the only thing in the world that did not hit back. It was Nettie Farnsworth who came on the fourth day. Nettie was 68 years old, built like a barrel stave with forearms that would have done credit to a man twice her size. She had been the town blacksmith for 20 years, ever since her husband had died of a heart attack at the forge in '54, and she had kept the business going by herself because nobody else in Flint Creek knew how to shoe a horse or mend a plow blade, and because Nettie Farnsworth did not believe in quitting. She rode up to the Harwell place on a mule so old it appeared to be moving backward, and she sat on that mule for a good 10 minutes watching Edith and Cormac cut sod before she said a word. Then she said, "You are going to need a better blade than that." Edith looked up. Nettie swung down from the mule. She walked over to the pile of bricks. She picked one up. She turned it in her hands. She squeezed it. She sniffed it. "Good sod," she said. "Deep roots. This will hold." She set the brick down. She looked at Edith. "I saw women build with sod in Nebraska in '52, she said. "Out near the Platte River. Whole families. Their cabins were still standing when I came through again in '61. 9 years and they had not moved an inch." She reached into the saddlebag on the mule and pulled out a long, flat blade with a wooden handle. It was the kind of blade a blacksmith makes for a specific purpose, not a tool you could buy in a store. The edge was honed to a clean, bright line. "I made this last night," Nettie said, "for cutting sod. The angle is different from a regular spade. You will find it goes through the roots easier." She held it out. Edith took it. She tested the weight. It was perfectly balanced. "Thank you," Edith said. Nettie nodded once. She did not smile. Nettie Farnsworth almost never smiled, not because she was unhappy, but because she considered smiling to be a waste of facial effort. "I will not be back," Nettie said. "I cannot be seen helping you. Not while the judge has his eyes on this place. But the blade is yours." She mounted the mule. She looked down at Edith from the saddle. "Build it thick," she said, 2 feet if you can, and slope the roof low on the north side. The wind comes from the north here, always from the north." Then she rode away, and Edith stood with the new blade in her hands, and the weight of it felt like the weight of something being given that could not be purchased and could not be repaid. The town began to talk in the second week. It started at the Mercantile the way all talk in Flint Creek started, because the Mercantile was where everyone went for flour and salt and nails and gossip, and the gossip was usually cheaper than the nails. "Have you seen what the Harwell widow is doing out there? She is cutting up the prairie and stacking it like bricks. She is building a house out of dirt. A house out of dirt. Can you imagine in Kansas? In October, with winter coming, the woman has lost her mind. The talk reached the Rusty Spur Saloon by the end of the first week, and by the end of the second week it had reached Judge Cornelius Slade, who was sitting in his usual chair at the back of the saloon with a glass of bourbon and a cigar, and the look on his face that he wore when the world was arranging itself to his satisfaction. Slade listened to the talk. He did not laugh. Slade was not a man who laughed at things. He was a man who calculated them. He sat in his chair and he smoked his cigar and he listened to the men at the bar describe the widow's foolishness. And when they were finished, he set his glass down and he spoke. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have a proposition." The saloon quieted. It always did when Slade spoke because Slade owned the building the saloon was in and the building next to it, in the land under both of them. And a man does not make noise when his landlord is talking. "I understand," Slade said, "that Mrs. Harwell has taken it upon herself to build a shelter out of prairie sod. I understand that she believes this shelter will stand through the winter and protect her from the elements. I do not believe it will. I believe the first hard storm will flatten it. I believe the rain will melt it. I believe the wind will tear it apart. And I believe that when it does, Mrs. Harwell will finally understand that she cannot survive out there alone, and she will do the sensible thing, which is to sign the deed and move on." He paused. He drew on his cigar. "But I am a sporting man," he said, "and I believe in giving every person a fair chance, even a woman who has more courage than he does. So I will say this. If that sod cabin is still standing on the 1st of March, 1875 intact and inhabited, I will tear up the promissory note. I will forgive the debt, and I will stand before the congregation at Reverend Alcott's church and apologize to Mrs. Harwell by name, in front of the whole valley." There was a murmur in the room. Men looked at each other. Nobody had ever heard Judge Slade offer to apologize for anything. But Slade said, and the word hung in the air like a stone at the top of its arc, "If the cabin has fallen, if it is washed away, if it has proven to be what I believe it is, which is a pile of mud pretending to be a house, then Mrs. Harwell will sign the transfer of deed that same day. She will vacate the property within the week, and she will leave Flint Creek, Kansas, and not return. Those are my terms. They are fair. They are final." He picked up his glass. He drank. And nobody in the saloon noticed that the side door, the one that led to the alley between the saloon and the feed store, was open just a few inches, and that a 14-year-old boy with dark hair and bruised wrists was standing in the alley listening to every word. Cormac Hollis ran the 3 miles to the Harwell place in less than 20 minutes. He arrived out of breath, red-faced, his boots caked with mud from the creek crossing. Boone met him at the gate and ran alongside him into the yard, and Edith came out of the half-built walls of the sod cabin with mud on her hands and straw in her hair. "Mrs. Harwell," Cormac said, bent double, gasping. "The judge." At the saloon, he made a wager. "Slow down, boy. Breathe." He breathed. He told her every word of it, the way Peter Alcott's boy had told Niels Lindqvist in a valley far away, the way boys have always carried the words of powerful men to the people. Those words were meant to wound. When he was finished, Edith stood very still. She looked at the sod walls rising around her. She looked at the bricks stacked and waiting. She looked at the sky, which was turning the color of cold iron, and she looked at the bomb, and she looked at the dome, and something settled in her face that Cormac would remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, not fear, something older than both. Something that had been building in her for 8 months, or maybe for 35 years, and that had finally found its shape. "Hitch the mule," she said. "Ma'am, hitch the mule, Cormac. I am going to town." She rode into Flint Creek on Walter's old mule at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She dismounted in front of the Rusty Spurs saloon. She tied the mule to the rail. She straightened her apron. She pushed open the door. Every man in the room turned to look at her. No woman had ever walked into the Rusty Spur saloon in the 11 years of its existence. The bartender's hand stopped halfway through polishing a glass. Orville Pratt, sitting at a corner table, choked on his whiskey. Judge Slade, in his chair at the back, did not choke. He set his glass down very slowly and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been dealt a card he did not expect. "Judge Slade," Edith said. Her voice was steady. It carried the way a bell carries, clear and clean, through the tobacco smoke and the silence. "Mrs. Harwell," Slade said, "this is not a place for—" "I understand you have made a wager concerning me," she said. Slade's eyes narrowed. He glanced at Pratt. Pratt looked at the floor. "I have made no wager," Slade said carefully. "I have made an offer. Then I accept your offer." The silence in the saloon was complete. You could hear the clock on the wall. You could hear the horse outside shifting its weight at the rail. "If my cabin is standing on the 1st of March, Edith said, you will tear up the note. You will apologize to me before the congregation. Those were your words. Those were my words. And if it is not standing, I will sign your paper and leave Flint Creek. Those were also your words." They were. "Then we have an agreement, Judge. I will shake your hand on it if you are not too proud to shake the hand of a woman with mud on her fingers." Something moved across Slade's face. It was not admiration. It was not anger. It was something closer to recognition, the look of a man who has just realized that the person across from him is not who he thought they were. He stood up. He walked across the room. He took her hand. His grip was hard. Hers was harder. "The first Sunday in March," he said, "before God in the valley, before God in the valley," she said. She let go of his hand. She turned. She walked out of the saloon. The door closed behind her. The men in the room did not move. The bartender resumed polishing his glass, but his hands were shaking. Outside, Edith untied the mule. She mounted up. She rode home in the last light of the October day, and the wind was behind her, and the grass was bending in the wind, and somewhere in the tall grass to the east a meadowlark was calling, and Edith Harwell rode home to her half-built cabin with the sky turning purple above her, and the first star coming out above the ridge, and she did not look back. That night she sat at the table by the light of a single candle with Boone at her feet, and her charcoal drawing on the wall in front of her. She studied it. She measured it in her mind. She calculated. She had 4 months. She had 1 mule. She had 1 spade and 1 sod-cutting blade, and a 14-year-old boy who was not hers, but who came anyway. She had a dog with a broken heart and a coat that was growing thick for winter. She had $17 in a coffee tin and a dead husband's signature on a piece of paper, and a judge who wanted her land in a valley full of people who thought she had lost her mind. And she had the grass, miles and miles and miles of it, stretching to the horizon in every direction, thick and strong and rooted, deep in the Kansas earth, free for the taking, waiting to be cut and stacked, and shaped into something that would stand. She picked up the charcoal. She added a line to the drawing. She thickened the north wall. She lowered the pitch of the roof on the north side the way Nettie had told her, because the wind comes from the north here, always from the north. She set down the charcoal. She looked at the drawing. She looked at Boone. 5 months, boy, she said. 5 months, and we either have a home or we have nothing. And I did not bury Walter Harwell on this land to walk away from it. Boone thumped his tail against the floor. Once, twice. Then he put his head on her boot and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind came across the flats and pressed against the walls of the old cabin, and the cracked ridgepole groaned, and the gap on the north side let the cold in, and somewhere out on the prairie, a coyote called once and fell silent, and the stars turned slowly overhead, and the grass bent and straightened and bent again, and Edith Harwell sat at the table with her drawing and her candle in her mouth, and she was not afraid. She was not afraid because she had already lost the worst thing she could lose, and everything after that was just weather. And weather, she had decided, was something she could build against. She finished the walls on the last day of November. It had taken her and Cormac the better part of 6 weeks working from first light until the sun dropped below the western flats and the cold came in hard enough to make the mud mortar freeze before it could set. 6 weeks of cutting and hauling and stacking 6 weeks of 30-pound bricks, carried one at a time from the cutting ground to the building site. 6 weeks of mud mixed by hand in a shallow pit she had dug beside the creek. 6 weeks of pressing and fitting and sealing, until her hands were so cracked and raw that she had to wrap them in strips of cloth torn from one of Walter's old shirts just to hold the spade. The cabin was small, 12 feet by 14, one room, one door facing south away from the wind. One window also south, covered with a piece of oiled canvas stretched tight over a wooden frame because she could not afford glass. The walls were 2 feet thick, just as she had drawn them, just as Nettie had told her. 2 feet of packed earth and woven roots and dried grass, dense as stone, heavy as the ground itself. The roof was a framework of cottonwood poles laid close together and covered with a layer of brush and then a layer of sod grass side up, so that by spring the roof would be green and growing a living thing on top of a living house. The chimney was the hardest part. She had built it from fieldstone gathered along the creek, the same kind of stone Walter had used for the chimney of the old cabin. She had carried each stone herself because the stones were too heavy for Cormac, and she had fitted them together with mud mortar, the way she had watched Walter fit them 5 years before. And when she was finished, the chimney drew clean and strong, the smoke rising straight up into the cold November sky without a whisper of draft or leak. She stood in the yard on that last day of November, and she looked at what she had made. It was not beautiful. It was squat and brown and shapeless, like a large clod of earth that had decided to grow a door. The walls were rough, the roof sagged slightly on the east side where she had not gotten the poles quite level. The oiled canvas in the window fluttered in the wind like something trying to breathe. But the walls were thick, and the door fit tight, and the chimney smoked clean. And when she went inside and closed the door and lit the fire in the stone hearth, the room warmed in a way that the old cabin had never warmed, not in 5 years, not even when Walter was alive and keeping the fire high. The sod walls did not just keep the cold out. They held the warmth in. They held it the way the earth holds the warmth of summer deep in its bones all through the winter, slowly, patiently releasing it in a steady breath that filled the small room like a living presence. Cormac stood in the doorway and watched the fire catch, and he put his hand against the inside wall and held it there, and his eyes went wide. "It is warm," he said. "The wall itself is warm." Edith nodded. She had expected this. She had felt it in the prairie dog tunnels. She had felt it in the cave banks along the creek. The earth remembers heat the way wood does not, the way logs cannot, because logs are dead, and the earth is not, and the roots in the sod were still alive, still holding, still breathing in their slow vegetal way, and the warmth of the fire soaked into those roots and into the dirt between them, and stayed there radiating back into the room long after the flames had burned down to coals. She moved into the sod cabin that night. She carried her bedroll and her cooking pot and her tin plates and her coffee and her flour and her salt and her $17 in the coffee tin. She carried Walter's chisels still wrapped in their oilcloth. She carried the tintype photograph. She carried the promissory note in the tin box because she wanted it close, wanted to see it every day, wanted to remember what was at stake every time she opened her eyes in the morning. Boone came in last. He walked through the door and he circled the room once, nose to the ground, reading the place the way dogs read places. He stopped at the hearth. He lay down. He put his chin on his paws. He looked up at Edith. "Home," she said. Boone thumped his tail. "Once." The people of Flint Creek came by to look. They did not come in groups. They came alone or in pairs, pretending to be on their way somewhere else, slowing their horses or their wagons as they passed the Harwell place, craning their necks at the strange brown structure that had risen up out of the prairie like a growth. Some of them laughed. Most of them did not. Because the cabin was standing and the walls were thick and smoke was rising from the chimney, and whatever else you might say about Edith Harwell, you could not say she had given up. It was during the first week of December, a week after Edith moved in, that the trouble came. It came at night, past midnight. Boone woke first. He lifted his head from the hearth, and a sound came from deep in his chest, not a bark, not a growl, but that low, vibrating hum that meant something was wrong. Something was out there, something that did not belong. Edith woke. She lay still. She listened. Scraping against the north wall, the sound of metal on earth, a spade or a pry bar working at the base of the wall where the sod bricks met the ground. Slow, deliberate, the sound of someone trying to undermine a foundation. She reached for Walter's rifle above the door. She did not light a lamp. She moved to the window and pressed her face against the edge of the canvas and looked out into the moonlit yard. Two shapes, dark against the pale grass. One was digging at the base of the north wall. The other was standing watch, looking back toward the road. They were working fast, pulling bricks loose from the bottom course, kicking dirt away from the foundation, trying to create a weakness that the first good storm would find and exploit. Boone was on his feet now. His body was rigid. His lips were pulled back from his teeth. He was not making a sound, but every muscle in him was coiled and ready. Edith put her hand on his collar. "Easy," she whispered. "Not yet." But Boone had been Walter's dog before he was hers, and Walter had taught him to protect what was his, and what was his now was this woman in this cabin and this piece of ground, and Boone did not wait. He lunged for the door. Edith's hand slipped from his collar. He hit the door with his shoulder, and the latch gave, and the door flew open, and Boone was out into the yard in a single bound, 70 pounds of muscle and teeth, moving low and fast across the frozen grass toward the north wall. The man who was standing watch saw him first. He shouted something, a curse or a warning, and he turned and ran. The man who was digging looked up just in time to see Boone coming at him like a dark shape launched from a cannon. Boone hit him at the knees. The man went down. Boone was on him, snarling, his jaws clamped on the man's forearm, and the man was screaming and thrashing and trying to kick free. The kick landed, not on Boone's head, on his ribs, the left side. A heavy boot driven hard into the ribcage of a dog that weighed 70 pounds and had never in his life been hit by anything except the wind. Boone yelped. It was a sound Edith had never heard him make, a high, sharp, broken sound that went through her chest like a blade. He let go of the man's arm. He staggered sideways. The man scrambled to his feet and ran, clutching his torn sleeve, and Edith heard footsteps pounding away through the grass and the distant sound of horses, and then nothing. She ran to Boone. She knelt beside him. He was lying on his side in the frozen grass, his breath coming in short, shallow pants, his tongue lolling. She put her hands on him gently, feeling his ribs. He whimpered when she touched the left side. Something shifted under her fingers that should not have shifted. No, she said. No, no, no. She gathered him up. He was heavy, but she lifted him the way she had lifted Walter's body 8 months before, with a strength that came from a place beyond muscle, beyond will, from the part of her that had decided a long time ago that she would not lose anything else, not one more thing, not on this ground, not under this sky. She carried him inside. She laid him on the bearskin beside the hearth. She built the fire up high, higher than she should have, higher than was safe because the cold was in him now, and the only thing she knew to fight it with was warmth. She sat beside him all night. She talked to him. She told him about Walter. She told him about the day Walter had brought him home as a puppy, a squirming ball of black and tan fur tucked inside his coat. She told him about the way Walter used to laugh when Boone brought home dead snakes and laid them on the porch like offerings. She told him about the morning after Walter died, the morning Boone had come and put his head in her lap and had not moved for 3 hours. "You are all he left me," she whispered. "You are the only thing in this world that Walter touched that is still warm. You do not get to die, Boone, not here, not now. Walter sent you to stay with me, and you are going to stay." Boone's breathing steadied sometime before dawn. His eyes opened. He licked her hand. Just once. Then he closed his eyes again and slept, and Edith sat beside him with her back against the sod wall, and she pressed her palms against her face, and she breathed, and she did not cry because she was saving that for something she had not yet earned. In the morning, she went outside and looked at the north wall. 3 bricks had been pulled from the bottom course. The foundation had been partially undermined along the stretch of about 4 feet. If a storm had come that night, a real storm, the kind that would arrive in January or February, the wind would have found that weakness, and it would have pushed and pushed until the whole north wall buckled inward, and the roof came down, and everything Edith had built in 6 weeks of labor would have been a pile of mud and grass and broken dreams. She knelt beside the damage. She looked at the boot prints in the frost. She recognized the print, not the man, the boot. She had seen boots like that at the Slade Ranch, expensive boots, with a distinctive heel, the kind Orville Pratt wore. She did not go to the sheriff. She did not go to the reverend. She did not go to anyone. She went to the creek, and she mixed a fresh batch of mud, and she carried it back, and she repaired the wall herself. And she added a second course of bricks along the entire base of the north side, reinforcing it, thickening it, making it stronger than it had been before. Cormac came that afternoon. He saw the repair work. He saw the boot prints she had not yet covered. He saw Boone lying by the hearth, breathing shallow, his left side swollen. "Who did this?" he said. His voice was quiet. His hands were fists. Edith looked at him. She saw the anger in his face, and she saw the helplessness beneath it, the particular fury of a boy who knows who hurt something he loves and cannot do anything about it. "It does not matter who," she said. "It matters." "No, Cormac, it does not. What matters is the wall. The wall is stronger now than it was before they came. That is the only answer worth giving." He looked at Boone. The dog was watching him with one eye half open. "Will he be all right?" Cormac said. "He will be all right," Edith said. "He is too stubborn to die." And she believed it. She had to believe it. Because if Boone died, then the last living thing Walter had loved would be gone, and Edith was not certain she could survive that. Not because she was weak, but because there is a limit to what even the strongest person can carry, and she was close to hers. It was 3 days later that Lenora Slade came. She came in the early afternoon on foot, which was strange because the Slade Ranch was 2 miles distant, and Lenora Slade had never been known to walk anywhere. She was a small woman, 55, with silver blonde hair pulled back tight, and a face that had once been beautiful, and was now merely dignified, the face of a woman who had spent 30 years standing beside a man who took up all the room in every space he entered and had learned to make herself narrow. She came to the gate. She did not come into the yard. She stood there with her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked at the sod cabin, and she looked at the repaired north wall, and she looked at Edith, who was splitting kindling by the woodpile. "Mrs. Harwell," she said. "Mrs. Slade." Edith set down the hatchet. She walked to the gate. The two women stood on either side of it. The fence between them, the coal between them, and something else between them that was larger than either. "I have brought something," Lenora said. She held out a small cloth bundle. Edith took it. She opened it. Inside was a jar of dark ointment that smelled of camphor and pine tar, and a roll of clean linen bandage. "For the dog," Lenora said. "I heard he was hurt." Edith looked at her. She did not ask how Lenora had heard. She did not ask who had told her. She knew. "Thank you," she said. Lenora did not leave. She stood at the gate and she looked at the cabin, and she was quiet for a long time, and Edith could see that the older woman was working up to something the way a person works up to a confession, slowly, painfully, against every instinct that says to keep the thing buried where it has always been. "May I tell you something?" Lenora said at last. "You may. We had a son," Lenora said. "Cornelius and I, a boy named Theodore. He was 18 years old in 1870. She paused. The wind came across the flats and moved the grass, and Edith waited. "There was a storm that February," Lenora said. "Not the worst we had seen, but bad. Bad enough. We were living in the big house than the one Cornelius had just finished building. He had built it himself. He was very proud of it. It was the largest house in Flint Creek. 2 stories. Pine lumber hauled all the way from the mill in Lawrence. Tall windows. A wide porch. Beautiful, people said." Cornelius loved to hear that word. Beautiful. She stopped again. Her hands were tight against each other. But it was not built for weather. It was built for show. The walls were thin. The roof was heavy, too heavy for the span. The windows were large and they let the cold in. "I told him, Mrs. Harwell, I told him in September that the north wall needed bracing. I told him in October that the roof beams were bowing. I told him what I could see with my own eyes, and he told me that a woman does not understand construction, and that a Slade does not ask for help, and that the house was fine." She drew a breath. "The storm came in February. On the second night, the roof gave way. Not the whole roof, just the north side where the beams had bowed, where the snow had piled up because the pitch was wrong, because the pitch had been designed to look elegant rather than to shed weight. The north side came down into Theodore's room. He was sleeping. He did not wake up. He did not have time to wake up. The beam struck him across the chest, and he was gone before we could reach him." Edith stood very still. The wind moved the grass. Boone inside the cabin shifted on his bearskin. "Cornelius rebuilt the house that spring," Lenora said. "He rebuilt it with thicker walls and a steeper roof and smaller windows. He did everything that Theodore had needed him to do in September, and he did it in April after the ground had thawed, after the funeral, after the coffin had gone into the ground. And he has never spoken Theodore's name since that day. Not once, not to me, not to anyone. He has carried it the way a man carries a wound that he gave himself in silence and shame, and he has turned that shame into something hard and cold, and he has pointed it at the world. And when he sees someone else building the right way, the simple way, the way that puts safety before pride, he cannot bear it. Because it reminds him of what he did not do. It reminds him of the boy he could have saved." Lenora looked at Edith. Her eyes were wet but steady. "That is why he hates your cabin, Mrs. Harwell. not because it is made of sin, because it is made right, because it is made by a woman who would rather live in dirt than let pride kill what she loves. And Cornelius cannot look at that without seeing Theodore's face. She paused one final time. I came to tell you this so you understand what you are standing against. It is not a wager. It is not about money. It is not about land. It is about a man who killed his own son with pride and who cannot forgive the world for reminding him of it. She turned. She walked back down the road toward the Slade Ranch, and Edith watched her go. And the ointment was warm in her hands and the wind was cold on her face, and inside the cabin, Boone made a small sound in his sleep, and Edith stood at the gate for a very long time after Lenora Slade had disappeared into the distance, because she had just been given a piece of knowledge that changed everything and nothing at the same time. She went inside. She knelt beside Boone. She opened the jar of ointment, and she spread it gently, very gently, along his swollen ribs, and he whimpered once and then was still. And she wrapped the linen bandage around his body snug, but not tight, the way you wrap a wound that needs both pressure and patience. We are going to be all right, boy, she said. Both of us. She fed the fire. She sat beside him. She did not sleep for a long time. The first real storm came in the third week of December. It began at noon on a Tuesday, with the sky turning the color of lead and the wind dropping to nothing, that terrible stillness that comes before the worst weather, the silence of a world holding its breath. Edith had felt it before. She had felt it before Walter died. She had felt it in the hours before the typhoid took him, that same flatness in the air, that same sense that something very large was about to happen and there was nothing to be done about it except be ready. She was ready. She had spent the weeks since the wall was finished stockpiling firewood inside the cabin, stacking it along the east wall from floor to ceiling, dry cottonwood and elm she had cut from the deadfall along the creek. She had sealed every gap in the doorframe with strips of cloth dipped in tallow. She had packed extra sod against the base of the north wall, the wall that had been undermined, reinforcing it until it was nearly 3 feet thick. She had stored water in every container she owned because she knew from experience that a well could freeze in a hard storm and stay frozen for weeks. Cormac came at noon. He was out of breath. Storm coming, he said. I could feel it on the ridge. I know. Edith said, come inside. He hesitated. Mrs. Harwell, if the judge finds out I am here. Cormac, come inside. He came inside. Edith closed the door. She barred it. She fed the fire. The storm hit at 3 o'clock. It did not build slowly. It arrived all at once like a wall of white slamming into the side of the cabin, and the sound of it was a roar so deep and so constant that after the first hour, Edith stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a waterfall when you live beside one. The wind came from the north, as Nettie had said it would, and it hit the north wall of the sod cabin, and the north wall did not move. It did not creak. It did not shift. It stood there, 2.5 feet of packed earth and root and grass, and the wind broke against it the way water breaks against a stone in a river, and the stone does not move. Inside the cabin was warm. Not just warm, it was the particular kind of warmth that comes from being surrounded by the earth itself, warmth that does not flicker and does not fade, a warmth that is in the walls and in the floor and in the air, steady and deep and patient. The fire in the hearth added to it, but even when the fire burned low in the small hours of the night, the walls kept giving back the heat they had stored during the day, and the cabin never went cold. Boone lay by the hearth. His breathing was better. The swelling on his ribs had gone down since Lenora's ointment, and he had started eating again, small meals, dried venison and broth. He was not healed, but he was healing. And in the warm glow of the firelight, with the storm howling outside and the sod walls standing firm, He looked at Edith with those dark, steady eyes, and she saw something in them that she had not seen since Walter died. She saw trust, not just the trust of a dog for its owner, the trust of a living thing that knows it is safe. The storm lasted 2 days. When it passed, Edith opened the door and stepped out into a world made entirely of white. The snow was knee-deep in the yard and waist-deep in the drifts against the north wall. The sky was blue. The air was sharp. The old cabin, Walter's cabin, 50 yards to the east, had lost what remained of its roof. The ridgepole had snapped in the night, and the rafters had come down, and the whole structure lay open to the sky like a broken rib cage. But the sod cabin stood. Edith walked around it. She checked every wall. She checked the chimney. She checked the roof. Not a crack, not a shift, not a single brick out of place. The snow had piled against the north wall, and the north wall had taken it absorbed. It held it the way a mother holds a difficult child, with patience and without complaint. She went back inside. She sat at the table. She looked at Walter's drawing on the wall. "One down," she said. Cormac was already up. He was feeding the fire. He looked at her and he did not speak, but there was something on his face that she recognized, because it was the same thing that had been on her own face the day she had walked into the Rusty Spur saloon. It was belief. The weeks between the first storm and the second were the hardest of the winter, not because of the weather, but because of the hunger. Edith had stored what she could: dried venison, cornmeal, salt pork, dried apples, coffee. But she had stored for one person and a bow, and now there were two people in Edom, and the stores went faster than she had calculated. By the 1st of January, the cornmeal was half gone. By the 10th, the salt pork was finished. By the 15th, she was rationing the dried venison to a few strips per day, divided 3 ways: one for her, one for Cormac, one for Boone, and the strips were getting thinner. Cormac set snares. He was good at it, better than Edith had expected, and in the first week of January he brought home 3 rabbits. Thin winter rabbits with not much meat on them, but enough to make a stew that lasted 2 days. He set the snares along the creek bottom where the rabbits came to find water, and he checked them every morning before dawn, and every morning Edith watched him go out into the cold and come back with his hands red and his face chapped, and whatever he had found held against his chest inside his coat. On the 15th of January, he came back with nothing. The snares were empty. The rabbits had moved on or gone deeper underground. He stood in the doorway with his empty hands and his empty face, and Edith saw on that face the thing she feared most: not hunger, not cold, but the beginning of defeat. The look of a boy who had started to believe that trying was not enough. She stood up from the table. She put her hands on his shoulders. "We are not finished," she said. "Do you hear me, Cormac? We are not finished." He looked at her. His eyes were wet, but he did not let the tears fall. "What do we do?" he said. "We go further," she said. "We go further out. We find what the land has left." They went out together that afternoon, Edith and Cormac and Boone, who was walking again, now slowly favoring his left side, but walking. They went south along the creek, past the snare lines, past the deadfall, where Edith had cut her firewood, past the old stone ford, where the water ran even in winter. They walked for 2 miles in the snow, scanning the ground, looking for tracks, looking for burrows, looking for anything that was alive and edible. They found wild turnips buried beneath the snow. They found a patch of dried service berries still clinging to a stand of bushes along the south bank. They found in a hollow beneath an overhanging rock ledge a cache of dried grass and seed that some industrious prairie mouse had stored for the winter, and that would, when boiled with salt and a little dried venison, make something that was not quite porridge and not quite stew, but was warm and filling and would keep them alive for another week. Cormac carried the turnips, Edith carried the berries. Boone carried himself, his tail up, for the first time in weeks. Not bad for a couple of survivors, Edith said as they walked home in the late afternoon light. And Cormac looked at her and he almost smiled, and Boone walked between them with his nose in the wind, and for a moment, just a moment, the three of them looked like something that no one in Flint Creek would have called them. They looked like a family. It was on the night of the 28th of January that Edith almost broke. Cormac was asleep. Boone was asleep. The fire had burned down to coals and the cabin was lit only by the dull orange glow from the hearth. The wind was outside testing the walls, running its fingers along the seams, looking for a way in. And Edith sat at the table in the near dark, and she looked at the promissory note spread flat on the table in front of her, Walter's signature at the bottom, and she looked at the tin box where the marriage certificate lay beside the tintype photograph, and she looked at her hands cracked and bleeding, and older than they should have been, and something inside her gave way. Not all of it, not the foundation, just a wall. Just one wall, the one she had built inside herself the day Walter died, the wall that kept the grief on one side and the doing on the other. That wall cracked and the grief came through, and she put her face in her hands and her body shook, but she did not make a sound because Cormac was 10 feet away and the book had enough weight on him without carrying hers. She cried for perhaps 5 minutes. She cried for Walter. She cried for the cabin he had built that was now a pile of broken wood in the snow. She cried for the boy who had been kicked by a man paid to destroy what she had made. She cried for the boy sleeping on the floor who had nowhere else in the world to go. She cried for herself, which was the thing she had not allowed herself to do in 11 months, because self-pity is a luxury that widows on the Kansas frontier cannot afford. When she was finished, she wiped her face on her sleeve. She folded the promissory note. She put it back in the tin box. She banked the fire. She went to check the walls, running her hand along the sod the way she did every night, feeling for cracks, feeling for cold spots, feeling for any sign that the earth was giving way. The walls were warm. The walls were solid. The walls were holding. She went to bed. She lay down beside Boone on the bearskin. The dog shifted and pressed his back against her legs, and his warmth mixed with the warmth of the walls and the warmth of the coals, and Edith closed her eyes and slept. In the morning, Cormac was already up. He was kneeling by the hearth, feeding the fire, careful and precise the way Edith had taught him. Shavings first, then twigs, then small splits of dry cottonwood. The fire caught. The cabin warmed. The coffee heated. He looked at her when she sat up. He did not say anything about the night before. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply poured her coffee and set it on the table and went back to the fire. Edith looked at him. She saw Walter in the set of his shoulders and the careful way he handled the wood and the quiet competence of a young man who had learned that the best thing you can do for someone you love is the next thing that needs doing. "Thank you, Cormac," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. That was all. That was enough. The second storm came on the last day of January. It was worse than the first. Edith knew it would be. She had felt it building for 3 days, the pressure in the air, the strange warmth that sometimes comes before the worst cold, the silence of the birds. She had spent those 3 days reinforcing. Extra sod against the north wall, extra firewood inside, extra water melted and stored. She had sealed the canvas window with a second layer of oiled cloth. She had packed dried grass into every crack she could find. The storm hit at midnight. It came from the northwest, this time harder and colder than the December storm, with a wind that did not howl so much as scream, a high, thin, relentless sound that went on and on and on. The snow was not falling. It was flying, horizontal, dense, like being inside a white wall that was moving at 60 miles an hour. The sod cabin did not move. The old cabin, Walter's cabin, disappeared entirely. The last of its walls went down in the first hour, buried and broken, and by morning there was nothing left of it but a low mound in the snow that you would not have known was a house unless you had seen it standing. 3 other cabins in the valley went down that night. The Pearson place on the South Fork lost its roof and both side walls. The Holloway cabin near the Mercantile collapsed inward when the chimney cracked at the base. The old Talbot homestead, which had been barely standing since the previous winter, simply ceased to exist, scattered across a quarter-mile of prairie like a hand of cards thrown into the wind. And somewhere in the darkness, between the second and third hour of the storm, while Edith was feeding the fire and Cormac was checking the door seal, and Boone was lying by the hearth with his ears flat against his head, there was a sound that was not the wind, a pounding on the door. Edith went to it. She lifted the bar. The wind hit her like a fist. And in the doorway, white with snow, lips blue, eyes wide, stood Nettie Farnsworth. The old blacksmith had walked half a mile through the storm. Her cabin had collapsed at midnight. She had been trapped under a beam for 2 hours before she had freed herself, and she had walked the rest of the way with a broken finger and a cut above her eye that was bleeding down her face and freezing as it bled. Edith pulled her inside. She closed the door. She sat Nettie by the fire. She wrapped her in a blanket. She cleaned the cut and bound the finger and gave her hot water with a little sugar dissolved in it because the coffee was gone. Nettie sat by the fire and she shook for a long time. Then she looked at the walls. She looked at the thick, warm, solid walls of Edith Harwell's sod cabin, and she said in a voice that was hoarse and broken, but still had iron in it, "I told you it would stand." Within the hour, 2 more came. A young couple from the next claim over the wife, barely able to walk, the husband carrying a bundle that turned out to be a baby wrapped in a coat. Then Reverend Phineas Alcott alone, his spectacles broken, one lens gone, his right hand burned from trying to save his books when his cabin stovepipe collapsed. By dawn, there were 8 people in Edith Harwell's sod cabin. 8 people in a 12 by 14 room with 2-foot walls and a sod roof and a stone chimney that smoked clean and steady while every other chimney in the valley choked and cracked and went dark. Edith fed them. What little she had she gave. She measured it by the spoonful. Dried venison broth, boiled turnips, the last of the cornmeal mixed with water and cooked on a flat stone beside the fire. Nobody complained. Nobody asked for more. They ate what she gave them, and they were grateful, and they were alive. She gave everyone a task. Nettie one-handed sorted kindling. The young husband carried firewood from the stack along the east wall. The young wife with the baby in her arms melted snow for drinking water. Reverend Alcott, half blind, without his spectacles, mended a tear in a blanket with a bone needle and thread he produced from his coat pocket. Cormac tended the fire the way Edith had taught him, careful, precise, never too much, never too fast. And Boone lay by the hearth and watched them all, his eyes moving from face to face, and his tail thumped once whenever someone new came close to the fire, and he did not growl at anyone, not even the strangers, because Boone understood the way dogs understand things that people sometimes cannot, that everyone in this room belonged here now. On the second evening of the storm, while the wind still screamed outside and the fire burned low, and the 8 souls in the cabin sat in the orange glow of the coals and tried not to think about what the morning would bring, there was another knock on the door. Edith opened it. Lenora Slade stood in the snow. She had a child in each arm, 2 grandchildren, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, both half-conscious, both wrapped in everything Lenora had been able to pull from the Slade house before she left. Lenora herself was barely standing. Her hair was wild, her coat was torn, Her face was the face of a woman who had done the hardest thing she had ever done in her life, which was to walk out of her own house and leave her husband behind. Edith pulled her in. She pulled the children in. She looked past Lenora into the storm. "Cornelius," she said. Lenora sank onto the bench beside the fire. Nettie wrapped a blanket around her. The children were laid beside Boone, who shifted his body to make room and pressed his warm flank against the smaller child, and the child stirred and did not wake. "He would not come," Lenora said at last. Her voice was a whisper. The roof, part of the roof came down. The north side again, always the north side. And the wood got wet, all of it, and the fire went out. And I said, "Cornelius, we must go to Mrs. Harwell's cabin. It is the only shelter left." And he said, she stopped. She pressed her hand over her mouth. He said he would rather freeze than ask a woman who built her house out of dirt to save him. The cabin was quiet. The wind screamed outside. The fire crackled. Edith looked at the door. She looked at the storm. She looked at Boone, who was warming the children with his body. She looked at Cormac, who was already reaching for his coat. Then she looked at Lenora. "How far?" she said. 2 miles, Lenora said. "Straight north." Edith pulled on her coat. She pulled on her boots. She wrapped her scarf around her face. "Mrs. Harwell," Reverend Alcott said from the corner. "You cannot. Not in this." Edith looked at him. "Reverend," she said, "that man took my land, called me a fool, sent someone to hurt my dog, and tried to destroy my home. And he is lying in a broken house 2 miles from here, in the worst storm this valley has ever seen, and he is going to die there tonight if someone does not go get him." She pulled her gloves on. "And I am going to go get him," she said, "because Walter would have gone, and Walter is not here. So I will." She opened the door. The wind hit her. She leaned into it. She stepped out into the white. Cormac was behind her. "You are not coming," she said. "Yes, I am," he said. She looked at him, 14 years old, thin as a fence rail, coat too small, boots held together with twine, standing in a blizzard with his chin up and his eyes steady and his hands in fists. She almost told him to go back inside. Almost. Then she did not. "Stay behind me," she said. "Hold the rope. Do not let go." They walked into the storm. The 2 miles north to the Slade Ranch took them nearly 2 hours. It should have taken 30 minutes on a clear day. But nothing about that night was clear, and nothing about it was a day. The storm had swallowed the world. There was no sky. There was no ground. There was only the white moving and howling and pressing against them from every direction, and Edith walked into it the way she had walked into everything since Walter died, one step at a time, with her head down and her hands forward, and the rope tied around her waist, and Cormac's weight on the other end of it, the boy leaning into the wind behind her, his boots punching through the crust of snow with every step. She could not see. She navigated by feel, by the slope of the ground beneath her boots, by the direction of the wind against her right cheek. She knew this land. She had walked it for 5 years with Walter, and 5 years was enough to learn the shape of a place so deeply that your body remembers it, even when your eyes cannot. She knew where the creek bottom dipped. She knew where the old fence line ran along the ridge. She knew where the cottonwoods stood in a row along the north property line, and she used them the way a blind woman uses the walls of her house, touching them as she passed, counting them, knowing that after the 7th cottonwood, the ground would rise and the Slade Ranch would be 300 yards ahead. She fell once. Her foot went through a drift into a hole she could not see, and her ankle turned, and she went down hard on her hands and knees, and the cold came up through her gloves and her coat and found the skin beneath and bit. She got up. She kept walking. Cormac did not fall. The boy was lighter, and he stepped in her tracks, and he held the rope, And he did not speak not once in 2 hours because he understood that speech. In a blizzard is wasted breath, and wasted breath is wasted heat, and wasted heat is death. They reached the Slade Ranch just after midnight. The house loomed out of the white like a dark shape half swallowed by the earth. The north side of the roof had collapsed inward, just as Lenore had said. Timbers jutted at broken angles from the snow, and the windows on the north wall were dark and shattered, and the whole structure listed to one side like a ship taking on water. Edith went to the front door. It was blocked by a drift 4 feet high. She went around to the side. The kitchen door was clear enough to force. She put her shoulder into it and pushed, and the door gave, and the cold that came out of that house was the cold of a tomb. She stepped inside. The darkness was total. She had brought no lantern because a lantern would have blown out in the first 10 seconds of the walk. But she had brought a tin of matches in her coat pocket wrapped in oilcloth, and she struck one now, and the small yellow flame showed her a room that had stopped being a room and had become something else. The kitchen ceiling had partially fallen. A beam lay across the table at an angle. Snow had come in through the broken window and covered the floor in a thin white sheet that crunched under her boots. She moved through this kitchen into the parlor. The match burned down. She struck another. Judge Cornelius Slade was sitting in a chair beside the coal stove. He was wrapped in a heavy wool coat and a buffalo robe, and his hat was still on his head, as if he had been preparing to go somewhere and had decided not to. In his lap, cradled in both hands the way a man cradles something precious, was a small framed photograph. Even in the matchlight, Edith could see what it was. A tintype of a young man 18 or so, with his mother's silver hair and his father's jaw, looking out from the frame with the earnest, unfinished expression of a boy who still believes the world will be kind to him. Theodore. Slade's eyes were closed. His face was gray. His lips were the color of old slate. His breath, if he was breathing at all, was invisible. Edith knelt beside him. She took off her glove and pressed 2 fingers against his neck just below the jaw, the way she had pressed them against Walter's neck 11 months before, in this same kind of silence. A pulse, faint, slow, but there. He is alive, she said. Cormac appeared behind her. He had found a lantern in the kitchen and gotten it lit. The weak yellow light showed the room more clearly now, the collapsed ceiling, the broken furniture, the snow that had drifted in through cracks in the walls and lay in thin lines across the floor like the markings of some cold geometry. His leg, Cormac said. Edith looked down. Slade's right leg was pinned beneath a timber beam that had fallen from the ceiling when the roof gave way. The beam was not large, but it was heavy, and it lay across his shin at an angle that meant the bone beneath it was either broken or very close to broken. We need to move that beam, Edith said. They tried together. Cormac was 14 and thin. Edith was exhausted. They got their hands under the beam, and they lifted, and the beam moved 2 inches and slid back. Again, Edith said. They lifted again. 3 inches this time. Edith kicked a piece of broken chair leg under the beam to hold the gap, and Cormac reached in and pulled Slade's leg free, and the old man groaned but did not wake. Now we carry him, Edith said. Cormac looked at her. Mrs. Harwell, he weighs twice what I do. Then we drag him. They could not carry him. Edith had known they could not. She had carried Walter's body to his grave, and she had carried Boone from the yard to the hearth, but those weights had been lifted on the fuel of adrenaline and grief, and she had nothing left in that tank now, nothing but the slow, stubborn, ordinary strength of a woman who has decided she is not going to let a man die, not even this man, not even tonight. They wrapped him in the buffalo robe. They tied the rope around his chest under his arms. They dragged him out of the chair and across the parlor floor and through the kitchen and out the side door and into the snow. The storm was still screaming. The wind hit them the moment they cleared the doorway, and it tried to take the robe and the rope, and the man and all of them sideways into the dark. Edith braced herself. Cormac braced himself. They pulled. They pulled Cornelius Slade 2 miles through a blizzard on a buffalo robe. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of hauling and resting and hauling again, of leaning into the wind and finding the cottonwoods by touch and counting them backward, this time 7, 6, 5, 4, and the ground dropping beneath their feet as they came back down into the valley, and Edith's arms screaming and her back on fire and her lungs burning with cold and her boots full of snow that had melted against her skin and frozen again. Cormac did not stop. Not once. The boy pulled alongside her, the rope over his shoulder, his boots digging into the snow, his jaw set, his eyes forward. 14 years old and pulling a 200-pound man through the worst storm in the history of Flint Creek, Kansas. And he did not stop, and he did not complain, and he did not ask to rest. They came through the gate of the Harwell place just before dawn. The sod cabin was a dark shape against the slightly less dark sky, and the chimney was smoking steady and clean, and the door opened before they reached it because Nettie Farnsworth had been watching from the window for 5 hours with the lantern in her hand. They pulled the buffalo robe through the door. Reverend Alcott and the young husband helped lift Slade off the robe and onto the floor beside the stove. Lenora was there. She knelt beside her husband, and she put her hands on his face and she said his name. And his eyes did not open, and she said his name again, and his eyes did not open, and the third time she said his name with her forehead pressed against his and her voice breaking, and his eyes opened. They were not the eyes of Judge Cornelius Slade. They were the eyes of a man who had been somewhere very cold and very dark, and who had come back from it changed. "Lenora," he whispered, "I am here. The children, they are here. They are safe. They are warm." He closed his eyes. Tears ran down the sides of his face and into the buffalo robe beneath his head. Edith did not see this. She had made it through the door, and she had seen that the people inside were alive and the fire was burning, and Boone was lying on the bearskin with the 2 Slade grandchildren pressed against his warm flank, and she had stood there for perhaps 3 seconds, and then her legs had given out and she had gone down against the wall, and Cormac had caught her arm and lowered her to the floor, and someone had put a blanket around her, and someone else had pressed a cup of warm water into her hands, and she had closed her eyes, and the world had gone dark. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, it was the afternoon of the next day. The storm was still blowing, but it had lost its fury. The wind had dropped from a scream to a moan. The snow was still falling, but lighter now, and through the canvas window Edith could see the faintest suggestion of gray daylight beyond the white. The cabin was full of people, 16 now. More had come during the night while she slept. Families who had lost their homes, men and women and children who had followed the single column of smoke that rose from the only chimney still standing in the valley. They were packed into the 12 by 14 room so tight that there was barely space to turn around, and they were sitting on the floor and leaning against the walls, and the children were sleeping in laps, and the women were melting snow in every pot and pan and tin cup Edith owned, and the fire was burning low and steady, and the walls were warm. She sat up. She looked around. She found Cormac. He was by the stove feeding it the way she had taught him. Shavings and twigs and splits. Careful, precise, his face was drawn with exhaustion, but his hands were steady. She found Slade. The judge was lying on the floor near the south wall, his legs splinted with a piece of broken chair leg and wrapped in strips of cloth. His face was pale, but his eyes were open. He was staring at the ceiling, at the rough cottonwood poles and the layer of sod above them, at the thick, warm walls that had surrounded him, at the room that was keeping him alive. Lenore was beside him. The grandchildren were asleep against Boone, who had not moved from his spot by the hearth, and who was radiating heat like a furnace built of fur and loyalty. Edith stood up. Her body protested every movement. Her back was a landscape of pain. Her hands were swollen and cracked. Her ankle, the one she had turned on the walk north, throbbed with every heartbeat. She went to the stove. She took over from Cormac. "Go sleep," she said. The boy looked at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He went to the corner and lay down on the floor and was asleep before his head touched the earth. The days that followed were a test of everything Edith had built, not just the walls, but the woman inside them. 16 people in a room built for one. Food that had been barely enough for three was now divided 16 ways, measured by the teaspoon, rationed to the mouthful. Water had to be melted constantly. Firewood had to be managed with the precision of a clockwork. The door could not be opened more than twice a day because every opening let in the cold and cost 15 minutes of heat. Edith organized them the way a general organizes a campaign. She did not raise her voice. She did not give speeches. She looked at each person, assessed what they could do, and gave them a task. To Nettie, whose broken finger had been splinted and bound, she said, "You sort the kindling. Smallest in the first box, finger thick in the second. You do not stop until both boxes are full." To the young husband, she said, "You bring wood from the stack along the east wall, 2 armloads every 4 hours. No more, no less." To Reverend Alcott, half blind and one-handed, she said, "You mend. Everything that is torn gets mended. Blankets, coats, socks. You are a man of the cloth, Reverend. Put that to use." To Lenora Slade, she said, "You tend the water. Every pot stays full. Every cup stays clean." To Cormac, she said nothing. She did not need to. The boy already knew. They ate twice a day. Broth made from the last of the dried venison, stretched with melted snow, and whatever wild turnip or dried berry Edith could add to it. It was thin. It was not enough. Nobody complained because nobody in that cabin had the standing to complain to the woman who had dragged their judge out of a frozen house and carried him home on a buffalo robe. On the third night after Slade's rescue, with the storm finally beginning to ease and the wind dropping to something that no longer sounded like the end of the world, Slade spoke. He had been silent for 3 days. Silent while Lenora tended his splinted leg. Silent while his grandchildren climbed over him and pulled his beard and fell asleep on his chest. Silent while the people of Flint Creek moved around him and fed the fire and melted the snow and kept each other alive in the cabin of the woman he had tried to destroy. He spoke in the evening when the fire was low and the room was quiet and most of the children were asleep. He did not sit up. He could not. His leg would not allow it. He spoke from his back, lying on the floor of Edith Harwell's sod cabin, looking up at the ceiling. He had wagered would not stand. "I need to say something," he said. The room went still. Every adult in the cabin was awake. Every eye turned toward the voice. Slade looked at the ceiling a long time. Then he turned his head and he looked at Edith. She was sitting at the table with a tin cup of warm water in her hands. She looked back at him. Her face was unreadable. "I had a son," Slade said. "His name was Theodore. He was 18 years old." The room was very quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moaned softly against the thick sod walls. In 1870, Slade said, "I built a house, the biggest house in Flint Creek. I built it because I wanted people to see it from the road and know that a Slade lived there. I built it with tall windows and wide rooms and a roof that was beautiful and useless. I built it the way a man builds when he is building for his own pride and not for the people who will sleep under it. His voice was steady. He was not looking for sympathy. He was not performing. He was laying stones one by one the way Edith had laid sod bricks, building something that needed to be built, no matter how much it cost. The storm came in February of that year. The roof was too heavy. The pitch was wrong. The north side collapsed. It collapsed into Theodore's room. He was sleeping. He did not wake up. The beam came down across his chest and he was gone. Lenora made a small sound. She put her hand over her mouth. She had heard this before many times in the silence of her own heart. But she had never heard her husband say it out loud in front of others in the light. I rebuilt the house that spring, Slade said. I rebuilt it the way it should have been built from the beginning. Thicker walls, steeper roof, smaller windows. Everything Theodore needed. Everything I should have done in September when my wife told me to do it. But I did not do it in September because I was too proud. And my pride killed my son. He paused. The fire shifted. A log settled. When I saw your cabin, Mrs. Harwell, he said, and his voice cracked for the first time, just a hairline fracture running through the stone of it. When I saw what you were building out of nothing but grass and dirt, and your own two hands, I saw the thing I should have built for Theodore. I saw walls that would not fall. I saw a roof that would hold. I saw a woman who would rather live in the earth than let pride stand between her family and the cold. And I could not bear it. I could not bear to look at it, because every brick you laid was a reminder that I had failed my son. He looked at the ceiling again. His eyes were wet. I took your husband's land because I was angry. Not at him, at myself. Walter Harwell was a good man. He was the kind of man who builds things right the way his wife builds things right. And I could not stand to be near that kind of goodness because it showed me what I was. He borrowed $200 from me because he was desperate and I was the only man with money to lend. And I took his land as collateral because I wanted power over him. And when he died, I used that power against his widow. And I have no excuse for any of it except this. A man who has killed his own child with pride will do terrible things to avoid being reminded of it. He reached inside his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Everyone in the room knew what it was. He held it out toward Edith. She did not move. She sat at the table with her tin cup, and she looked at the paper, and she looked at the man holding it, and she did not reach for it. Your husband borrowed that money to buy medicine that might have saved his life, Slade said. He borrowed it from a man he did not trust because he loved you more than he feared me. He signed his name on that paper knowing he might die because he wanted you to have seed in the ground and a chance at a crop after he was gone. He was a better man than I have ever been, Mrs. Harwell, and I am not going to hold his love for you over your head for one more day. He tore the paper in half. He tore it again. He held the pieces out, and Reverend Alcott, who was closest, took them from his hand, and the Reverend looked at the torn pieces, and then he looked at Edith, and then he looked at the ceiling, and he took a breath that shook in his chest. Edith sat very still. She did not thank Slade. She did not forgive him. She did not say anything about the land or the money or the wager or the men who had come in the night to undermine her wall and kick her dog. She said only one thing. Your son would have been 23 this year. Slade closed his eyes. A sob broke from him, a single terrible sound. The sound of a dam breaking after 4 years of holding, and Lenora put her arms around his head and held him. And the room was very quiet, and the fire burned, and the walls held, and outside the storm was finally dying. The storm ended on the morning of the 5th day. Edith opened the door. The light was blinding. The sky was the impossible blue of a Kansas winter morning after a great snow, and the world was white and still and silent. and the smoke from her chimney rose straight up into the windless air like a thread connecting the earth to heaven. She stepped outside. The snow was waist deep in the yard. The old cabin, Walter's cabin, was gone entirely. Just a faint depression in the white where it had stood. The fence posts along the road had disappeared. The cottonwood trees along the property line were half buried, their bare branches black against the snow, like the fingers of something reaching up from underground. She looked south toward town. She could see 3, maybe 4 columns of smoke rising in the distance. Not many. The rest of the chimneys were silent. She looked north toward the Slade Ranch. Nothing, just white. She looked at her own cabin. The sod walls stood thick and brown and solid against the snow that had drifted against them on every side. The roof had not shifted. The chimney had not cracked. The canvas window was intact. The doorframe was plumb. It had held everything she had built with her own hands in Cormac's hands, and 30-pound bricks of Kansas prairie sun had held through the worst storm the valley had seen in 20 years. 16 people were alive behind her. 16 people who had been warmed by a cabin made of dirt. She stood in the snow and she looked at the sky and she did not cry. Not yet. The people left over the following week as the roads opened and the drifts began to settle. They left in pairs and in families, walking back down the valley toward whatever remained of their homes, carrying blankets and stories in the memory of warmth. Every one of them stopped at the gate. Every one of them turned back to look at the cabin. Every one of them wanted to say something, and most of them could not, because what do you say to a woman who fed you from her last stores and wrapped you in her blankets and walked into a blizzard to save a man who had tried to take everything from her? Nettie was the last to leave. She stood at the gate with her splinted finger and her mule that someone had found tied to a fence post half a mile away, alive and ornery. She looked at Edith. "I told you it would stand," she said. "You did," Edith said. Nettie mounted the mule. She sat there for a moment. "Your husband," she said. "He would have been proud." Edith nodded. She could not speak. Nettie rode away. It was on the 9th day after the storm, on a gray morning, with the snow beginning to soften under a pale February sun, that the baby came. The young wife, the one who had arrived with her husband and their first child in the early hours of the great storm, had been feeling pain since the day before. She had not told anyone. She had kept quiet because she did not want to add to the burden of a cabin that had already carried too much. But by midnight, the pains were close and hard, and there was no hiding it any longer. Edith woke to the sound. She knew that sound. She had heard it once before, years ago, when a neighbor woman in Indiana had given birth in a farmhouse kitchen while Edith held her hand. She had never had children herself. She and Walter had wanted them. They had tried. It had not happened, and after a while they had stopped speaking of it, the way couples stop speaking of things that hurt too much to name. But she knew the sound of a woman in labor, and she knew what needed to be done. Lenora Slade, who had borne 3 children of her own, took charge. Nettie had left, but Lenora was still there, still tending her husband's splinted legs, still watching over her grandchildren. And when she heard the young wife cry out, she rose from the floor with a calm that spoke of deep experience, and she said, "Boil water. Fine clean cloth. Give her something to bite." Edith boiled the water. She tore strips from a clean flour sack. She knelt beside the young wife, and she held her hand, and the grip was so tight that Edith's fingers went white, and the fire burned, and the sod walls held, and outside the last of the winter stars turned slowly overhead. The baby came at dawn, a boy, small, red, furious at the world he had just entered, which was a good sign, because a baby who screams is a baby who breathes, and a baby who breathes is a baby who will live. Lenora caught him. She cleared his mouth. She wrapped him in a piece of wool blanket, that Reverend Alcott had been mending for 3 days, and that was now, the Reverend noted with a tired smile, the cleanest piece of cloth in the cabin. The young mother held her son. Her husband knelt beside her with tears streaming down his face and his hands shaking too hard to hold the baby himself. The first child, a girl of 2, woke and looked at the new arrival with the suspicious indifference of a toddler who has just been replaced. Edith stood apart. She stood by the door with her back against the sod wall, and she watched the family, the mother and the father, and the 2 children, and something moved in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. It was Cormac who asked the question. He was standing by the stove, the same spot he always stood tending the fire, watching the room. "What will you call him?" Cormac said. The young husband looked at his wife. His wife looked at Edith. "We have been talking about it," the wife said. Her voice was raw and tired and full of something that sounded like sunrise. "We would like to name him Walter, if that is all right with you, Mrs. Harwell. We would like to name him after your husband." Edith's hand went to the wall behind her. She pressed her palm flat against the sod, against the packed earth, and the woven roots and the dried grass that she had cut and carried and stacked with her own hands, and that had stood through 2 storms and held 16 people and kept them all alive. She tried to speak. She could not. Her mouth opened and no words came out, and her chin dropped, and her eyes filled, and the tears came finally for the first time since the night in January when she had cried alone at the table. But these were different tears. These were not the tears of a woman breaking down. These were the tears of a woman breaking open. She cried for Walter. She cried because his name, the name that had been on the promissory note and on the grave marker and on the tintype photograph and on the marriage certificate in the tin box, that name was now on a living child, a child born in a cabin made of dirt, a child whose first breath had been drawn in a room whose walls were built by the wife of the man whose name he carried. She cried for perhaps 1 minute. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, and she nodded. "It is a good name," she said. "It is the best name I know." Lenora Slade, holding the baby, looked at Edith across the room, and the 2 women held each other's gaze for a long moment. And between them passed something that did not need to be spoken, the acknowledgement that they had both lost and both endured and both carried things too heavy to set down and too precious to let go. Judge Slade, from his place on the floor, turned his face to the wall. His shoulders shook once and were still. The first Sunday of March, 1875, arrived under a sky so blue it looked like it had been scrubbed clean. The snow was melting. The creeks were running. The first green shoots of grass were pushing up through the brown stubble of the prairie, and the world smelled like mud and water and the particular raw sweetness of a Kansas spring. The whole valley came to Reverend Alcott's church that morning. Every seat was full. People stood along the walls and in the doorway and outside the windows because word had spread the way. Word always spreads in small towns that something was going to happen at the service, something that had never happened before and might never happen again. Edith sat in the 3rd row with Cormac on one side and Boone, who had no business being in a church but whom no one was going to argue with, on the other. Boone's ribs had healed. He walked without a limp. His coat was thick and glossy with the health that comes from being warm and fed and loved, and he sat beside Edith with his ears up and his eyes moving across the congregation with the calm vigilance of a creature who has done his job and knows it. Judge Cornelius Slade sat in the front row. His leg was still splinted. He had a crutch made from a cottonwood branch that Cormac had carved for him during the last days in the cabin. Lenora sat beside him. The grandchildren sat beside her. After the last hymn, Slade stood. It took him a long time to get to his feet, and Lenora reached out to help him, and this time he did not waver off. He took her hand. He leaned on the crutch. He turned to face the congregation. The church was silent. "My name," he said, "is Cornelius Slade. I have lived in this valley for 9 years. Most of you know me. Some of you have worked for me. Some of you owe me money. Some of you are afraid of me." He paused. "I stand here this morning because I made a wager with Mrs. Edith Harwell last October. I wagered that a cabin built of sod could not stand through a Kansas winter. I was wrong. The cabin stood. It stood through 2 storms that destroyed half the homes in this valley. It stood while I lay inside it with a broken leg, kept alive by the warmth of walls I had ridiculed and the generosity of a woman I had tried to ruin." He looked at Edith. "Mrs. Harwell," he said, "I owe you an apology, not because I lost a wager, because I was a coward and a fool. I tried to take your land. I sent a man to damage your cabin. I used your husband's debt as a weapon against his widow. And you walked 2 miles through the worst storm this valley has ever seen, and you dragged me out of my own house, and you carried me to yours, and you fed me from your last stores, and you did not ask me to apologize or to pay or to grovel. You just kept me alive, the way you keep everything alive that falls under your roof." His voice broke. "My son Theodore died because I built a house for pride instead of for shelter. Your husband Walter died because the world is cruel and the fever does not care how good a man is. But the difference between you and me, Mrs. Harwell, is that when your loss came, you built something that could save others. When my loss came, I tried to tear down what others built. And I am done with that. I am done with tearing down. Starting today, starting now." He reached into his coat. He produced a folded document. He held it up so the congregation could see it. "This is the deed to the Harwell homestead," he said, "40 acres in the buildings thereon. I am signing it over to Edith Harwell, free and clear, by this congregation filed with the territorial court. The land is hers. It has always been hers. It was her husband's land, and his sweat is in the dirt, and his widow's hands built the walls that stand on it. I have no claim to it. I never did." He signed the paper on the lectern. Reverend Alcott signed as witness. Nettie Farnsworth, who had come to the service with her arms still in a sling, signed as second witness. Slade turned to Edith one final time. "I am sorry," he said, "for all of it." He sat down. Lenora took his hand. The church was very quiet. Edith did not stand. She did not speak. She did not nod. She sat in the third row with her boy on one side and her dog on the other, and she looked straight ahead, and her face was still, and the light from the window fell across her hands, and those hands, cracked and scarred and strong, lay folded in her lap as steady as the wall she had built. After the service, she walked home. She walked the 2 miles back to her homestead with Cormac beside her, and Boone between them and the prairie was greening around them, and the creeks were running, and somewhere in the tall grass a meadowlark was singing, and Edith Harwell walked home to her sod cabin, and she split firewood that afternoon because the winter was over, but she had already decided she would never be unprepared again. That spring, Cormac Hollis became her son. Not by blood, by something stronger. She filed the papers with Reverend Alcott in the territorial court, and when the document came back with the seal on it, she pinned it to the wall beside Walter's drawing, and the tintype photograph in the marriage certificate, and the wall was getting crowded now, with the papers of a life that was rebuilding itself one document at a time. Slade paid for the reconstruction of every cabin that had been destroyed in the storms. He did not do it with fanfare. He did it quietly, sending lumber and nails and labor without being asked, and when men tried to thank him, he waved them off with a grunt that meant he did not want to talk about it. But the cabins he paid to rebuild were not built the old way. They were built with sod walls, thick, dense, 2 feet of packed earth and root. The men who built them came to Edith first came to her gate and asked, and she showed them the way she had shown Cormac, the way she had learned herself by watching the prairie dogs and the cave banks, and the way the earth holds its warmth. They called them Harwell Walls. The name spread. By the end of that first spring, 8 new structures in Flint Creek had Harwell walls, and by the following winter, when the storms came again, not a single one of them fell. 20 years later, on a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1894, a man stepped off the stage in Flint Creek, Kansas. He was 34 years old. He wore a good suit and carried a leather case, and he had the build and the bearing of a man who works with his hands for a living, even though his hands now hold pencils and drafting rulers instead of spades. His name was Cormac Hollis. He was an architect in Topeka. He had a little girl with him. She was 5 years old. She had dark hair like his and blue eyes like the woman who had borne her, and she held his hand as they walked down the main street of a town that had changed considerably since the winter he had pulled a judge through a blizzard on a buffalo robe. They walked 2 miles south along the road past the new schoolhouse and the new mercantile, and the row of sod-walled houses that stood along the creek bottom like a line of small brown fortresses, and they came to the Harwell place. The cabin was still there. 20 years of weather had gentled it. The walls had softened at the edges. The roof, which had been patched and resodded many times over the decades, was thick with green grass and wild flowers, and in the late afternoon light it looked less like a building and more like a piece of the earth that had simply decided to stand up and grow a door. A woman was sitting in a chair beside the south wall, in the spot where the afternoon sun came warm and golden through the cottonwood branches. She was 55 years old. Her hair had gone silver. Her hands resting on the arms of the chair were the hands of a woman who has worked every day of her life and has never once regretted it. She was thinner than she had been and slower, but her eyes were the same clear and steady and deep as well water. Beside the chair, on a low mound of earth marked with a flat stone, a small garden of wildflowers grew. The stone said Boone. Beneath it, next to a larger mound marked Walter Harwell, the old German shepherd lay in the ground he had defended in the shade of the cottonwood where Walter had liked to sit on summer evenings. Edith looked up when she saw them coming. She did not stand, she waited. Cormac came through the gate. The little girl held his hand and looked around with wide eyes at the strange brown cabin and the green roof and the flowers. Mama, Cormac said. She looked at him. She looked at the girl. She held out her hands. Come here, little one, she said. The girl let go of her father's hand. She walked across the yard. She put her small hand in Edith's rough one, and Edith held it, and she looked at the child, and she saw in that small face the future that Walter had borrowed $200 to protect. What is your name? Sweetheart, Edith said, although she already knew. Willa, the girl said, after your mama. Edith smiled. It was a rare thing, that smile. It did not come often, and it did not last long, but when it came, it changed her whole face the way sunlight changes a prairie when it breaks through clouds. She took the girl's hand, and she walked her to the south wall of the cabin. She pressed the child's palm flat against the sod. Feel that, Edith said. The girl pressed her hand against the wall. Her eyes went wide. It is warm, she said. Edith nodded. Your grandma built this house with her own hands, she said, out of the dirt under her feet, and it is still standing, and it is still warm, because the thing about Earth, little one, is that when you build with it, when you give it a shape and a purpose, it remembers, it holds, it stays. She looked at the wall. She looked at the skies. She looked at the mound where Boone slept beside Walter beneath the cottonwood tree. Everything that grows from the ground, she said softly, knows how to stay. And the sun came down through the cottonwood branches, and the wildflowers bloomed on the roof, and the meadowlark sang in the tall grass, and the wind came across the flats and pressed against the walls of Edith Harwell's sod cabin. And the walls did not move because they had been built by a woman who had lost everything and had decided to build it back out of the only thing she had left, which was the ground beneath her feet. And 20 years later, the ground was still holding.